I'm stating the bleeding obvious when I say that the global economy these days is based in a large part on huge and hugely complicated supply chains. It's also pretty obvious to say that those supply chains have never been more disrupted than they are now. So what can hard-pressed supply chain leaders in organisations all around the world do about that? How can they build resilience into their systems? One person who perhaps knows a bit more about this than most people is Alan Duncan. He was, until recently, the Vice President of Manufacturing Solutions at global supply chain platform provider Blue Yonder. Before that, he was a leadership partner at Gartner, and before that held leadership positions in supply chain organisations in many big companies all around the world, right the way back to the 90s when he was leading that kind of thing for Motorola, back when mobile phones were quite a busy new thing. What does Alan think about how companies can better deal with the disruptions that they're facing to their supply chains? He's got a few ideas. Alan, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about this topic, and it's an important topic. Supply chains, the disruption thereof, and how people can try to cope with them and the things that they should be thinking about. It's a topic that we carry quite regularly in our pages and on our websites and our channels and our videos, etc. But we are not experts, and not that many people really are, but happily you are. So if you could explain to us, perhaps, let's set the scene, give us some context. Supply chains have never been more troubled, or it doesn't feel like they have, than they are now. But what are we talking about when we talk about a disrupted supply chain? What's happening in the world that's making life rather difficult?
Well, I think what's interesting is that supply chains have always dealt with disruption. That's been their very norm for many, many years, certainly for the 30 years that I've been in supply chain management. I think what has happened more recently is that the significance of those disruptions has become much more apparent to the average person in the street. It was particularly highlighted by the COVID pandemic, which created an unprecedented set of conditions that supply chains had to deal with. So on the one hand, they had people changing their demand patterns quite considerably. They were no longer eating out. They were no longer buying new cars, but they were having to find comfort elsewhere. So that switched their spending power. And on the other hand, the COVID pandemic created a whole load of supply disruption, with factories closing down and opening up again and closing, and supply routes disrupted. And that became front page news. And all of a sudden, professors from universities like Cranfield were appearing on national TV to describe supply chain. And it came into your living room, basically. And so the problems that we as supply chain professionals had faced for years, maybe not to the same level, were all of a sudden apparent. And if you were asked your school children, how does your milk get to the supermarket, you might get the answer, well, the farmer takes it. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so there's this infrastructure that exists in all manufacturing and retail environments to move and to manufacture goods and get them to the end consumer. So fast forward on from the pandemic, where we're now very well aware of the challenges that supply chains are facing. We were looking to come out of the pandemic and move into a brave new world. The new normal was the phrase that was used. And lo and behold, the new normal didn't really materialize in a way that we expected it, because we then had the situation emerging in Ukraine with the invasion and the war there, creating all sorts of further disruptions, and then economic instability with fuel prices, gas prices going through the roof. These, again, are normal things for supply chains to deal with every day, but never have we seen the level of disruption as we are seeing these days. And I guess the frequency of disruptions, significant disruptions, has escalated. So we've still got disruption caused by the Ukraine crisis. Then we had economic instability as a result of the situation in Gaza and Israel. And then we start to see some more troubles happening in the Red Sea, which is affecting the supply of goods through the Suez Canal. So all of these things are, at a macro level, are causing challenges to our supply chain managers. And then you throw on top of that the natural economic uncertainty that has continued post-pandemic. And we see today in various guises with a low growth or no growth economy across most of Europe and beyond. That's creating different buying behaviors. So all of this is day-to-day to-do list for our supply chain managers to deal with. And then you throw in things like our networks are very complex. They're very long. We are moving towards a much more online driven society. So consumer products are being fulfilled in different ways. Customers are becoming more demanding. We still have skill shortages. We still have labor shortages. And we on the other side, we have customers wanting much more sustainable products and services. All of these are challenges that the supply chain manager has to deal with.
Absolutely. And there was an incident involving a rather large ship wedging itself in the Suez Canal at one point as well, wasn't there, I think?
Yes.
Even people who aren't really well versed with the complexity and scale of global supply chains kind of now understands that these are worthy of headlines. And so if you're unfortunately the person at the center of trying to work out how you can serve your company and its needs, negotiating all these issues, you become quite an important cog in what is a large machine. And I know that you've spent an entire career as that cog, if you like, or running those cogs in some very significant organizations, and nobody perhaps knows better what things need to be thought about to try and build resilience into those supply chains. So what would you say those people are experiencing at the moment as they try to navigate this? We know where the disruption is coming from, but how well geared up are most companies to actually try and deal with these in a sophisticated way at the moment?
So let me give you an example, a before and an after scenario. And these are two real stories, two different companies, but similar situations. So on the one hand, a situation where the company, who will remain nameless, didn't have access to great tools to manage their extended supply from Asia. And they had a number of containers on a container ship that was traveling from China to Europe with goods. I think it was about 5 containers. And as that ship was just sort of passing round into the Red Sea, it broke in two. And the stern and the bow started to drift apart, right. Genuinely. And for 2 weeks, no one was quite clear about what the consequences or what the circumstances would be, the outcome of this. Would we be able to salvage the ship's parts? Would we be able to salvage the cargoes? And ultimately, both parts of the ship sank and all the cargo was lost. But if you think about the supply chain manager who had product on that ship, firstly, they had to establish what products were in the containers, and that you do that by checking the ship's manifest. You check the logs to see was your cargo on that boat, and then you have to establish what the impact is of not having those goods, because the likelihood is you're not going to recover it. And so all of that processing of what products were it, what quantity was on there, when was it due to arrive, what demand was that there to fulfill, what's the impact of not getting it, how quickly can I recover the situation if I in the end do need that stock. When the ship broke apart, that whole exercise took 5 days.
Right.
Now, in this case, it just so happened that demand patterns had changed, and the stock that was on the water was no longer critical, and so there was no need to air freight or to recover the situation. But 5 days to establish a course of action, and that was because the company didn't have integrated tools, they didn't have clear visibility of the goods that were in transit, linking that to their demand patterns, their inventory profiles. And therefore, an extended time to establish the impact of that disruption. So that, and if we now take another example, and when you mentioned the ship's captain who decided to park his container ship across the Suez Canal, one of our customers, Blue Yonder customer, using real-time visibility tools, was able to identify within an hour of being alerted to that situation exactly what the impact was of the delay that they were likely to face. So what products were flowing through the Suez Canal on their way to satisfy customer demand, and what was the impact of any delay that they might have, and then they were able to take action. So a huge contrast between a company that doesn't have the visibility and the planning tools to be able to sense the disruption and then work out how to respond. You're talking days, maybe even weeks, as opposed to companies who've invested in technology to be able to see and plan a recovery out of that disrupted situation,
right.
And being able to do that in a matter of a few hours. Quite a contrast, and the service that the customer experiences at the end of it is drastically different.
Right. So the key difference here is that, as just to summarise what I think I understand you've said, is that there's a big difference between those companies that have got the insight and the data, access to it, the ability to process and analyse it and act on it, and those that don't. Now, I am going to go out on a limb and suggest that there might be quite a lot of companies out there who regularly ship lots of things around the world, often on kind of just in time, on a just in time basis, that maybe don't have all that data to hand. A lot of assumptions and maybe quite a lot of spreadsheets. Would that be true? Even big companies that are kind of locked into fairly old, well rehearsed but pretty old ways of working in that sense.
Yes, I think like anything, there's a spectrum. There are those companies. If you look at, for example, the Gartner Top 25 supply chains, a lot of those companies are very, very well developed in their supply chain systems to support those mature supply chains. And so you would look to them to be very aware of the exact location of the goods, an accurate understanding of their demand patterns, and being able to balance the supply and demand in a very effective way, probably with very established processes and the underlying data to support it. And then, like you say, there is still a large number of companies who have underinvested in their supply chain planning systems and visibility systems that really do struggle to deal quickly with disruption. And we've described a few fairly significant disruptions: wars, container ships being blocked or destroyed in some way. And these are not everyday events normally, but as a supply chain manager, you are dealing with some kind of disruption every day. It could just be that the vehicle didn't turn up on time to your warehouse to collect the goods to move it on to another distribution center, or your supplier delivers your parts 2 days late due to an unexpected delay upstream. And these are all situations that we have to deal with. And then it's not uncommon for some supply chains to experience medium-term disruptions. So maybe a supplier's factory experiences a significant disruption, maybe a fire that closes down some production lines, and that happens probably more often than you would expect. And that could jeopardize supply for a number of weeks or maybe months. And so the recovery is not necessarily about knowing about it today and tomorrow. It's about how do I manage over the next 6 months with this. And then you're getting into the world of planning solutions. And a lot of companies did invest back in the 90s in supply chain planning tools, but equally, a lot of those companies have not moved that technology on. And so today they're facing a situation where the tools they have in place are not well suited to the complexities that they have to manage and the responsiveness that is needed in the market. And so, yes, you may still be relying on Excel, but you may also be relying on an aging planning solution that isn't taking advantage of some of the latest developments in cloud computing technology or artificial intelligence, or even just mathematical optimization. And so you're not able to deal with the situations that are presented to you in a timely manner.
Let alone predict things that might be cascading as a consequence several steps down
Absolutely.
the line from an event of some
Absolutely.
sort. Right.
Yeah.
So,
and
sorry, Karen.
So what we did, when supply chains started to evolve, they became quite big beasts to manage, and so we created functional expertise. You had the planners who concentrated on balancing demand and supply primarily. You had the logistics people who looked at transportation. You had the warehouse management who looked at warehouse management. And we did that because that was a way to make the problem manageable. But in reality, in doing that, we were creating silos with communication gaps, with data gaps between them. And those gaps created delays, they created inconsistencies, and they created problems for the business to overcome. And that siloed environment is no longer acceptable. We haven't got the time, we haven't got the wherewithal to be able to survive with these silos. We've stripped out a lot of the cost. We're trying to run lean supply chains, and we don't have the luxury of having these gaps in communication and gaps in data. And so companies are still stuck with those legacy applications that are based on those silos, but with a need to become much more joined up along the length of the supply chain to be making decisions about what if this happens, how do I respond, will I be able to produce, will I be able to store, will I be able to move? Because in the past, we just assumed that we could move and we just assumed that we could store, so we went and made it anyway.
Yeah. So part of what I suppose the next question to you is, it sounds like an almost dystopian landscape for a supply chain manager at the moment, where they might be dealing with slightly anachronistic or antiquated systems and processes and silos in the organisation that they operate in. They're in an economic and financial context that means even if they went to ask the boss to invest in sorting this out, it's unlikely to necessarily happen at the scale they want it to, because it's a tough time to start making big investment decisions as a company, presumably. And it's a time where things seem to be disrupted almost every day by some group of people in one part of the world or another who are going to cause you problems on the day-to-day. So given all of that, in your position as, I'm gonna just call you the world's leading supply chain expert, brackets TM, at least for the purposes of our podcast, what would you start to tell those folks who are confronting all those simultaneous challenges?
Well, I think if maybe address your assumption for a moment, and I think one of the things that the pandemic, one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic, and there weren't many, but one that did, was the elevation of the supply chain to the fore. As we talked about before, it's headline news, people are aware of it. It's become a boardroom concern. And we struggled for many, many years, most of my career, to make supply chain a topic of conversation at board level. And so actually now boards, CEOs, CFOs, CIOs truly understand the significance of the supply chain and a smooth and efficient supply chain, and all of the pressures that it's under and all of the disruptions that it needs to face. So we are in a more fortunate position now that there is at least a sympathetic ear at board level in most companies now when the chief supply chain officer comes to them for investment. Having said that, you're absolutely right that now is not a great time for asking for massive investment in technology or infrastructure to address the supply chain because we're living in a low growth and no growth world. Cash is quite expensive to get hold of, and so what companies need to be looking at is the small steps, quick wins, a very clear understanding of the return on the investment that they're going to get in small increments. So for example, if you're a very consumer-led business, one thing that will be really key to you is to get a very strong handle on your demand patterns. And we've got the well-established tools that were based on statistics, and we've got this emerging technology, machine learning, that is very well suited to predicting future events based on a much broader understanding, a much broader range of drivers and factors than we would ever have with statistics, which pretty much relied on sales history and user input. So that's one thing that a lot of consumer goods companies particularly are seriously investigating and in some cases deploying, and equally with retailers, is that machine learning based forecasting, which is taking their forecast accuracy up a notch, because you're now able to consider many external factors, maybe up to 200, 300 external factors if they are relevant in establishing your demand drivers. So that's one area that companies have already started to look at. Now, the challenge with ML and developing your own models is it's all very well in the lab, it's all very well on the data scientist's laptop, but how do you scale that? And there aren't many companies have been able to scale the ML to a point where it is able to be used in earnest every day. There are a few players that have been able to scale it. So that's one example, I think, and that is a relatively easy step to take, particularly if you've got an established base of statistical forecasting. You can use the ML as an overlay to that to sense check the statistics, to look at alternatives, to challenge. And where the manual process used to kick in was you start with your statistical forecast, you go to the sales and marketing colleagues, you ask them for their input. Well, with ML, what you've got now is you've got that market sensing independently of the opinion of the marketer or the sales colleagues. Now, that doesn't mean that their opinion isn't valid anymore, but what it does do is it gives you that sense check to see, well, the ML model is telling us that the three critical levers here are price, competitor activity, and weather. Is that consistent with what our marketing and sales colleagues believe are driving changes in the demand patterns? And so you've got the ability to validate personal opinion, if you like, or expertise. Right. That's one example. I think visibility as a tool, again, is something that we realized during the pandemic was critical to supply chain, but not a lot of supply chains had it. It's not a massive infrastructure investment to be able to get visibility of your supply chain. There are syndicated data sources out there that allow you to get access to your containers, your cargo, the ship, and be able to predict when that ship is going to arrive into port, or that train, or that vehicle. So that there are steps like that companies can make, that will move them forward. And that sets a very strong platform for the next step, which may be a bigger and more significant investment in AI-based and mathematical optimization-based solutions that will be able to take all of that insight into demand and supply variability, demand and supply uncertainty, and process it and be able to help present companies with the options, the scenarios, the ways they can balance supply and demand at a sensible cost.
Yeah, and that's where we really get into the eye of the AI, isn't it? It's where we can take an algorithmic sorting of information to make it more useful and convert it into something that's helping us to make actual decisions on the fly. Particularly as those decisions need to be made more and more frequently, it would appear. So are there any examples of companies out there that are kind of approaching that, do you think, already? Because I think we're still quite early in that kind of AI-led process, aren't we?
Yes, and I think that there are a number of companies that have really moved into AI for the demand sensing, and that that is, it's still new, but it's becoming much more accepted norm. Where AI is still an emerging proposition, a prospect, is to be able to apply that to the supply world. And particularly, I mean, let's face it, our supply chains now are far more complex than they were when I was a planner planning mobile phones in the 1990s. And that was a crazy time. Mobile phones were growing at 20% a month. And so it certainly was far from a quiet time, but life was relatively straightforward. What were my key components? How many of them could I get? Therefore, what phones could I make? And then which customers should I sell them to? I didn't have the complexities of many alternative sources, long lead times with products coming from the Far East, and all the complexity there that we face today. And what you now face as a supply chain manager is an almost infinite array of possibilities, problems to overcome, and possibilities to overcome those. And the next step for AI is to be able to unpick all of those possible options, possible solutions to demand and supply imbalance, and present the user with the best solutions. Yeah. Now, you'll still have a business process that says, okay, this is what the system is recommending. There will be trade-offs to each of those alternates that, as they do today and as they have for many years, require evaluation not just by the supply chain team, but by the product marketing team, the field marketing team, the sales team, the manufacturing and procurement, because there are implications to all of these. There are costs associated with it. So I don't foresee in the next 5 years us getting to a point where supply chains are truly autonomous, hands off, and you just let the machine run it. What I do see is the machine is becoming much more intelligent in presenting the best options for the supply chain team and their peers across the different functions to then be able to make the right decisions.
Right. And then maybe we can see the machines making the decisions in 10, 20 years' time, and we can all just go to the beach.
Perhaps, and that's one of the things. It's artificial intelligence, it's machine learning. So if you tell the machine the decisions you've made and why you've made them, then it can learn from that, and then it gets better at presenting you with the options in future. There will still be always a human element to business decision making, because there's a strategy that needs to be enabled. That's not necessarily going to be reflected in any technologies. There are political situations that you don't understand within the system, and so on and so on. There are lots of external factors that will always exist that need some sort of human intervention on some decisions.
Well, as long as humans are the ones responsible for creating all the disruption, I suppose that's kind of implies it probably takes other humans to try and understand what's going on with it. But that's all great. I mean, if you were looking at the fleshy and unreliable parts of any organisation, i.e., the people, and you were advising a company that was saying, look, we're not handling our supply chains very well. There's tons of waste and missed opportunities in there. How would they need to start organising themselves culturally to start breaking down those silos that you mentioned, to try to understand what the 5-step plan is going to be to move themselves forward? How would they start on their journey?
So I've always firmly believed that change management is not something you do in a project. And before anyone who's listening to this sort of throws their hands up in the air and starts writing nasty tweets or whatever to me, it's essential in every project that you understand and you address the change that's required. What I mean when I say it's not part of a project, it has to be part of the culture. And so, in order to start to instigate major change, you have to make people comfortable with change at any level. A lot of businesses have, maybe they've done a major ERP implementation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and there was some change discussions around that. Maybe they've implemented a planning solution and there was some change discussions around that. But once the project was finished, that was it. And we start to operate business as usual. And that term business as usual is probably the killer of change management, because I don't think business as usual now means keep doing what you've always done. It means keep innovating, keep improving, keep enhancing what you've done, and create a culture where it's expected that every day you are addressing change, you are improving what you do, you are addressing problems. You don't let problems languish and continue to persist. You make them go away. And so, by establishing that culture of constant change, when you do need to make a step change in performance or introduce new ways of working, that culture is there and is already accepting of change. And I saw this firsthand when I was supply chain director at Travis Perkins. We did eventually implement a new planning system, but we introduced that planning system a year and a half after we started introducing a culture of change. And we made some significant investment in training and coaching throughout that period prior to the big project to help people to understand, firstly, that they had value to bring to the business beyond just doing their day job. But secondly, that change was not something that they should fear. Change was something that would make their working lives much more rewarding, much more interesting, much more exciting. And so over an extended period, I think about 15, 18 months, we started to establish that culture of every day making improvements. And then when the big transformational change came along, people were ready for it.
Right, that's fascinating. So if somebody's just beginning their journey in this area, they're saying, look, actually, the day-to-day and the normal is not good enough. We're going to have to start making step changes. How should they go about, beginning to open up ideas as well as their own minds to what possibilities exist, would you say?
Well, there's a number of tools that I've used in the past in various roles in my life that we're generally based around lean principles and being able to focus on small steps, quick wins, making progress, moving on. And so that's a good place for companies to start to engage this culture. Now, the other thing you might want to do is to follow me on LinkedIn, because over the next few weeks or so, I will start to post some tips and tricks that are very much geared towards what we've been talking about today.
Excellent. Well, I'm already doing that, so I won't miss out. Just in case supply chain management becomes a major issue in the creation of podcasts. I doubt it, but you never know.
You never know.
It is, and I'm. The fact that we had this conversation is really good and really timely, I think, because it's one of those things that is fundamentally important to kind of everything, certainly the world economy. It's something that is, unless we are able to grapple it and raise all ships, if you like, without wanting to mix too many metaphors, in terms of being able to become a bit more agile and intelligent about how we are accommodating disruption, all of us will struggle to keep ourselves and our businesses and so on afloat and successful, because the world is a-changing, as they say. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us today, Alan. It's been a fascinating conversation. I advise everybody to look you up on LinkedIn and give you a follow if they're interested in seeing what you've got to say over the coming weeks. And in the meantime, all the best in your adventures.
Thanks, great to be here.